Right, so this is going to be the sequel to my earlier video in which I talked about eugenics. Before I start, I just want to get a couple things off my chest. First of all, as you can see, I'm no longer wearing my workplace jacket. The funny thing is, I broke that a few days ago. What happened was the zip ended up getting caught in the middle of the zip line. It wouldn't move, so I had to pull it apart, and I ended up losing the zip. And the zip line itself was broken, so now I needed to get a replacement. Mind you, I've made three times now over the past 10 or 11 months that I've ordered replacement articles of clothing, and I've been having problems each time with my company and them delivering items of clothing. So whether I will receive a new jacket is anybody's guess. Second, as you can see, it's a lot brighter outside. It's the middle of the day. I decided to park my car outside my place of work and start this video log before starting my shift. That's this way I'd have more time. I'd have more time to talk in front of the camera, and also you'd get it would be less dark because we're in the winter now. Also, this here, I know what you guys are thinking. No, I'm not growing out this because of November. The reason I'm growing a mustache, it's not intentional. It's because I have really sensitive skin. I have a really sensitive upper lip. Each time I shave, I'm always likely to cut myself, especially on my upper lip. So I don't usually shave until there's so much hair that I can no longer focus or sit still and concentrate, which is going to have to be pretty soon, if I'm honest. So don't get used to this look. I don't want to carry on this and continue looking like a 1970s newscaster. All right, anyway, that about does it for the preamble. So, in my last video, I was discussing eugenics, how it can serve as a practical approach for dealing with the problems that a lot of antinatalists talk about in their videos. See, a lot of antinatalists feel like life is inherently meaningless, and while I'm not sure if antinatalists advocate a blanket ban on all couples having children, or if it is just for themselves, but as Rudyard Lynch, What If Altist, pointed out in his videos, each philosophy, every ideology is an externalized projection of one's own internal psyche. It's a rationalization based on one's own lived experience and internal psychology and how one deals with and copes with reality and living in the world. So I believe eugenics could be a compassionate and straightforward approach to helping us live and thrive in a world that is full of sober-minded, logical and rational people who are able to cope with and deal with life's hardships, and without life seeming like it is random, chaotic and meaningless. But in this part, I'm going to delve a little further and expound upon and elucidate the history of eugenics, why I believe it's especially important, and I also want to use it to say into a separate argument where I argue that one of the reasons why we are seeing a rise in antinatalism, people who espouse antinatalist beliefs, and why the world seems like such a terrible place, because make no mistake, it certainly is, whether you're antinatalist or not. I want to explain why that is, and why eugenics can, and retroactively why it could, have helped the world spin in a more favorable direction. So, starting off from the very beginning, if you type in antinatalism on Google and you click on the Wikipedia result, what you'll see is a smattering of quotations and pithy observations and general truths about life that have been made by philosophers over centuries. I think Epicurus, Arthur Schopenhauer, and this one other guy in particular, Peter W. Zapffer. Schopenhauer and Zapffer, I think, are the two main sort of antinatalist philosophers who are most well known. However, this gives antinatalists would look at this and they'd come to the conclusion that the world has always been a living hell, and people have always, since time immemorial, been able to pick up on this. So, in a sense, they would have us believe that what they are advocating is something that's nothing new. But this is misleading. This is misleading because you'd be getting the false impression if you read this, if you read the Wikipedia article on antinatalism and believe that people have always had existential dread and that they've always had an aversion to bringing children into the world. Now, people like Arthur Schopenhauer, and somebody actually recommended that I read and look into Arthur Schopenhauer at some point, maybe once I can find the time. I don't have a lot of free time, but maybe if I have a moment, I might take a cursory glance. I understand Schopenhauer, he was one example of a nihilistic philosopher. He did give forth a lot of opinions. There was one video by the real Mr. Antinatalist in which he read a series of quotations by Schopenhauer. However, you got to realize that people like Arthur Schopenhauer were not the norm. You know, he was a highly respected philosopher in his own right, and I do think a lot of scholars refer to him and his works, but his philosophy, his outlook on life, his antinatalism, the man himself, he never married and had children, was not commensurate with what most of the society, well, most Germans and most Europeans, most people around the world thought and felt at the time. The birth rate in Victorian Europe and indeed everywhere throughout the world was far higher compared to what it was now. I think the average family was having something like 6 children per family. So, so antinatalists might be led to the false conclusion that there's always been antinatalism, but that's not really true. In reality, antinatalism, especially in its modern incarnation, is a very recent phenomenon. Yes, there were seminal philosophers. Yes, there were many people throughout the ages who touched upon the themes of human suffering and it being inextricably linked with existing, and how you could avoid this pitfall, this dilemma, by choosing not to bring children into the world. But this was not a commonly held or prevailing mindset until recently. For instance, the word itself, antinatalism, was not even coined until 2006. And as I've argued in my earlier video in which I talk about incels, the coinage, the discovery of a new word, what that often implies, from an anthropological sense, it implies that there is the existence of an emergent new social phenomenon which did not previously exist, or which was so socially invisible it was not picked up on or remarked upon until then. So the fact that this word did not come into existence until 2006 suggests to me that what we're witnessing now, the rise in people who believe it is morally reprehensible to give birth to children in the world, signals to me that this is a somewhat newfound social trend. And it wasn't until 5 years ago, in 2019, I remember coming across this Guardian article about these people called the birth strikers, these female activists who are making a conscious decision not to bring children into the world. I actually even remember seeing one on TV. I thought it was a bit weird at the time, although many years since then, I mean, that was more or less my first introduction to the idea and the core tenets of antinatalism before I was ready to dig deeper and look into it and what it meant and so on. And also around this time, this is a real story, by the way, there was a guy by the name of Raphael Sam who apparently sued his own parents for giving birth to him. This sounds like something from an Onion article, but I assure you it's not. If you type in Raphael Sam on Google, you'll find this exact case. And what it all alludes to me, is that the increasingly prevalent use of words like antinatalism, the increasing cultural undertow of people who are nihilistic and pessimistic, cynical about modern life, who see all life as inherently bad and meaningless, and choosing not to bring children into the world and seeing it as a moral good to do so. What this tells me is that it is a recent phenomenon. People are looking retroactively at the words of Schopenhauer and Peter Zapffer to convey a modernistic opinion which in essence was not widely held, or at least not by a significant margin of the population, until at least the turn of the century. So that's the first point I want to make, and I want to segue that point into another, which may sound unrelated, but nonetheless, bear with me, because this is a key cornerstone of the argument that I'm about to make. So, second part is, it doesn't matter whether you are an antinatalist or not. You might think that life is inherently bad, that we're all born here to suffer, or you might take a somewhat nuanced view and think that life doesn't necessarily always have to be bad. It's more or less how you experience it. But make no mistake, the world right now is a shitty place. We're living in... Well, the world we're living in is run by idiots. It's run by clowns. We have this complete clown show of a government. All the pillars of our society have basically become this incestuous cabal where nobody is committed to the truth. Nobody's committed to setting a good example. There's, in a sense, as a civilization, we no longer really believe in anything. The people in power are really only out to line their own pockets and to appear morally virtuous, but in essence, a lot of them don't believe in anything. So let me just give you one of many examples of why I say this. First of all, let's talk about what our government is doing right now. What are they doing? Well, they're printing endless amounts of money in circulation, especially during the time of the pandemic. Both the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, they just endlessly kept on printing all that money with the magic money printer, which has in turn led to rising levels of inflation, double-digit inflation, which we haven't seen in decades, and the increasing rise in the costs of most goods and services. This idea of printing money into thin existence. Now, bear in mind, I'm not an actual economicist, but this is a stupid thing to do. This is what Weimar Republic Germany kept doing before Germany experienced one of the worst ever depressions in its history, which in turn led to the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler, because things were so bad. But the reason why the people think it's okay to do this is because of the rise of this new philosophy, this new economic policy, which sounds like a joke. It sounds like a meme that somebody made up on 4chan, but apparently it isn't. It's called modern monetary theory. Basically, modern monetary theory is this idea that you can print as much money as you want, and there won't be any consequences. Somebody could probably give you a bit more of an advanced and technical explanation, but that is unironically what everyone in the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and all the major banks are doing. They are intentionally causing inflation by adding more M1 to the global money supply. A sensible government would try and contract the money supply and retire currency out of circulation, like what Margaret Thatcher used to do. So what this would do is it would make all of us live under austerity. We'd be poorer in the short term, but in the long term, it means that the level of inflation could be checked, and we might get to afford more with our national currency compared to earlier. But that's not what our government and our banks appear to be interested in doing. In addition to that, let's talk about all the other major issues, like the housing crisis. So what is one of the main reasons why we have such a housing crisis, especially in the UK, is because there's too many people who live here. And a lot of the people who live here now, many of them didn't even exist here until the past few decades, because our successive governments have been pursuing a policy of mass immigration. Now, you might take the view, that immigration is a good thing. You might think that it's racist or it's far right to point this out. But you got to understand, there can be benefits to immigration. It can improve the economy. It can bring people over if they have good skills, if they have experience, they can add value to the economy. However, for immigration to be beneficial, it has to satisfy the following criteria. First of all, it has to be measured. We can't have too much, because there are lots of spaces that need to be occupied. They can't compete with the local people for resources. It has to be safe. They can't come from dangerous countries, and this would undermine trust in society and increase the likelihood of crime and all sorts of other terrible things. And ideally, they should come from countries that are culturally more similar to ourselves. Like, for instance, it would be a good idea if they spoke English as well. So this means they'd be more likely to blend in to the local population, and they'd be less likely to be perceived as a threat, and it would be less difficult for them to blend in and settle with the British population. But none of that can be used to describe what we currently have, the active policy that our government has been pursuing for the past few decades. We've been bringing in all kinds of Johnny foreigners from God knows where. India, Pakistan. A lot of these people come from countries where not only can they not read or understand English, some of them can't even read or understand their own language because they're illiterate. And to give you a personal example, as part of one of the places that I visit as part of my mail route is a town that basically looks like it's been affected by a 28 days later style apocalyptic event. Most of the shops are shut down. It's full of kebab shops and shady looking businesses and Turkish barbers. One of them has an Islamic faith center. I scarcely feel like I'm a citizen of this country when I step in a place like that. It's the place that the police and civilization forgot, honestly. And all this is happening. And you got to understand, I don't consider myself hateful towards people from other countries. It's just there is a smarter way of managing immigration. You can have your cake and eat it too, as long as you're sensible, as long as you take a sensible approach to letting people come in. You can bring in workers from other countries without turning them into hostile enemies who are competing with your own people for resources. And this has caused so many different problems, not the least of which the housing crisis. So one of the reasons why the housing crisis is quite complex, there are many other factors at play to consider, but one very simple explanation, one very noteworthy to the point cause, is that there's too many people competing for the same living space, and this has artificially driven up the prices of a lot of household properties, especially in places like London and other large cities where lots of people already live. So it all comes down to the fact that our governments are idiotic and retarded. Let me give you another example. Climate change. Now, a lot of people have a lot of different views about climate change. Some people think that it's a real threat, and many antinatalists even cite this as one of the reasons why they don't want to bring children into the world, because of the alarming threat of climate change. Myself, I take a bit of a different view, but again, that's neither here nor there. However, there are lots of people who are worried about climate change and the fate of the ozone layer and humanity. And our government wants to have us would have us believe that they are handling climate change seriously. We've got this net zero 2050 goal that our current government's been talking about. But what is the government actually doing? Is our government actually taking climate change seriously? No, it isn't. There's so many examples that I can cite to you to tell you that our government are hypocrites when it comes to climate change. But really, they want us to believe that they are virtuous, that they're advancing noble causes that the voters care about, just to get themselves elected back into office. But in reality, they're doing the opposite. One such example, I recall reading a newspaper article about the Scottish government. They felled 17 million trees to put up wind energy farms. How fucking retarded is that? You don't need to cut down trees to put up a wind farm. Even if you think wind farm energies are actually a good source of energy, which is honestly debatable, you don't have to put them in you could put them in the sea. You wouldn't have to cut down any trees to do that. Or you could choose to put it up in a place where there aren't any trees. Look, we need trees. This idea, like, even if you are the dumbest, most thick as pig shit average person who wants to solve climate change, even the dumbest person in the room knows that you don't solve climate change by cutting down trees, but that's what our retarded, thick as shit government is doing. So, let's not forget, honestly, there are way better solutions. There are far better solutions that exist, which would help us reach net zero and which would combat climate change and global warming much more effectively and at far less of a cost. For instance, we could invest in alternative renewable energy resources like hydroelectric energy, or better yet, nuclear energy, because nuclear energy first of all, it's a lot cleaner, and second, it's way more efficient. We get way more power out of that. But no, our government doesn't seem interested in pursuing nuclear energy. I mean, it would wean off our need for natural gas that we get otherwise from the Russians. Which, by the way, we've made a point of no longer getting energy like natural gas from the Russians because of fuck if I know. I mean, natural gas is a much more clean energy resource that would help us reach net zero. But no, our government is encumbered by the weight of its own stupidity and incompetence. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention. We no longer have our own coal mines. We shut down our own coal mining industry in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. Now, ostensibly, this means that we're trying to pursue net zero because we're no longer running on things like coal and stuff like that, right? Wrong. We don't produce our own coal anymore. We just import it from America. Where do I even begin here? See, by doing this, the government can look at us and say, but you see, we're not producing our own coal and oil. We're just getting it from elsewhere. But you see, we're still doing our part. But no, they're not. The demand for coal and oil hasn't gone down. They're still using it. They're just getting it from other countries. But basically, God, I spent way more time talking about this than I needed to. But the point I'm trying to make is that our government is a clown show. It's a gaggle of idiots. People who are, in every sense, unqualified, who are just not that bright. And the crux of the argument I'm making is that as a society, we are less intelligent than generations who existed before. Now, the points that I've made so far, the increasing prevalence of antinatalism and antinatalist philosophy, the fact that the world is run by retarded imbeciles who don't know their ass from their elbow, what does it mean, and how does this link in any way with eugenics? Well, this is where we say into my main argument for part 2 of my video series. So, there is a YouTube channel that I've been following for many years called The Jolly Heretic. It's run by a guy by the name of Ed Dutton. Ed Dutton is an adjunct university professor of anthropology at the University of Oulu, Finland. Ed Dutton wrote and produced a book a couple of years ago called At Our Wit's End, in which he essentially makes the argument that society, all around Western civilization in particular, is declining. It's in decline because we are becoming less intelligent and more mentally ill. So, if that seems like a bitter pill to swallow, let me explain the logic behind his reasoning and what the book essentially says. So, up until the 1790s, up until the time of the Industrial Revolution, we were all living under harsh Darwinian conditions of natural selection. See, each generation would produce children who you got to understand would be the technology for things like immunization against diseases, which there were so many different diseases that existed, which we've all but eradicated nowadays, which would weed out the sick and the vulnerable among each crop of newborn babies. A lot of people have this somewhat naive idea that evolution abruptly stopped when humans came into the world. I can assure you it didn't. Evolution is an ongoing process. Nature is ruthless when it comes to rooting out the sick, the runt of each litter. With every new generation, evolution is silently invoking its influence and getting rid, filtering out people who are too sick and too weak to carry on and propagate their species. And that's how things were up until the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So by the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had this phenomenal marked effect on humanity. It completely transformed and revolutionized it revolutionized human society in a way not seen since the agricultural revolution. It's a game changer by historical standards, because one of the many things that it led to is, first of all, it led to an explosion of productivity. We could achieve things, we could purchase things like textiles and other manufactured goods for a fraction of the price before the Industrial Revolution. So the cost of most goods and services went down, and advances in agriculture meant that we could produce way more food than we needed. So for the first time in history, starvation was no longer a threat. And also it led to a massive explosion in births and fertility. Now, before this, you got to understand that every human population that existed around the world was subject to a cycle known as the Malthusian trap, or the Malthusian cycle, where a population of humans would keep on breeding, they keep on having children, and they keep doing this until there were too many competing people, too many hungry mouths, and not enough resources to accommodate the massive population. So there would be a famine and lots of people would starve. This is what happened in the early 19th century in Ireland. This is what's referred to as the Great Potato Famine. The reason why Ireland suffered so badly during the Great Potato Famine is because it was an agrarian civilization. It had not yet industrialized. Most people who lived in Ireland, their diet consisted purely of one source of food, and that was the potato. And because there was a potato famine, people weren't able to eat potato, which was the only thing that they knew how to eat. They all a good whole third of them, I think, either died of starvation, and another third of them fled to America. It was a very dark time, but that's just how things were until the Industrial Revolution. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, for the first time as a species, we were able to break through the Malthusian cycle, and this led to an explosion in our population. People were having way more children. Our population basically quadrupled, I think, from the beginning to the end of the 19th century. Actually, I might need to double check that. It might not be that they quadrupled, but anyway, the population just rose exponentially. And on the one hand, this was good for all the people who were alive back then. It was delightful for them to know that for the first time they didn't need to worry that advances in science meant that they would be less likely to lose their children to polio, measles, rubella, cholera, or consumption, other serious diseases which used to be real killers. But on the other hand, what this also meant, thanks to advances in medical science that would reduce sudden infant death syndrome and other killers that got rid of and filtered out weak, sick people is that it had a transformation on our gene pool. So there were two people around the 19th century, Benedict Morel and Francis Galton, and both of them made the same observation, that because of the innovations, the scientific innovations that existed during the Industrial Revolution had allowed a massive spike in fertility and an increase in births. This led to there being an increasing number of children being born who would not have been allowed to exist otherwise, were it not for the advancements in medical science. So, and also, they also made the rather crude observation that there was an increasing number of people born from the lower orders of society, the riffraff. You got to understand, these people were both Victorian era scientists, and they didn't exactly mince words. You know, they were very elitist. They basically they drew all kinds of negative qualities and characteristics regarding the proliferation of offspring among the lower orders of society. They talked about how criminal traits and feeble-mindedness and mental instability was on the rise because the knaves, the rogues, were having more children than they otherwise would have been allowed to have had. Now, those observations were being made in the 19th century at the time of Francis Galton and Benedict Morel. Charles Darwin himself actually wrote a book about this called The Descent of Man. And this led to the rise and the implementation of eugenics and eugenicist policies. The American government was the first, America was the first country to implement eugenic policies. There was one particular justice who ruled for the involuntary sterilization of this woman. I think her name was Carrie Buck, and he famously remarked, we can't let people like this live. 3 generations of idiots is enough. It's pretty blunt. Yeah, ooh, those were his words back then. And of course, our favorite mid-century Germans, people like Hitler and the Nazis, they took their inspiration for their eugenics policies from the Americans. So this observation, this belief in things like racial hygiene and eugenics, this was all considered a very serious discipline up until the 1940s, when we saw the atrocities that were committed by the Nazis in the Second World War. And this led to a global sort of demoralization where the leading figures in all around the world no longer felt like it was right to pursue policies that were analogous to some of the biggest mass murderers in history. And it was from this point that around the world we began to rethink our approach to eugenics. It was seen as cruel and immoral, and worse, if we did this, we'd be just like the Nazis, and we don't want to be like the Nazis, do we? So from that point on, we stopped sterilizing people, and basically we just our society took a different turn. But you got to understand that with the selection pressures of evolution being absent, nature running its course, things carrying on as they were, more and more genetically sick people were being born into this world. And I should take this moment to talk about what I mean by genetically sick. See, in the context of evolution, and as argued in his book At Our Wit's End, Ed Dutton puts forth that what he means by genetically sick is people with significant levels of mutational load. See, all of us on some level, when we're born, we carry some degree of mutation. When a cell is transferred over and copied over, it isn't always copied. The information in a cell, in DNA, which is basically the blueprint for how to make a human, Sometimes the information in the cell can be copied over incorrectly. This can be due to a multitude of factors. It can be due to things like UV rays or gamma rays, which can have a seemingly insignificant effect, but it can end up having significant consequences. And this is what leads to phenomena known as mutations and mutational load. Some examples of minor mutations can include things like webbed fingers or webbed toes, a club foot or a cleft palate. And some of the more serious examples of hereditary diseases which are caused by mutations include things like sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Fragile X syndrome, Down syndrome, hemophilia, various kinds of cancers which are mainly hereditary, autism, ADHD. There is a strong genetic and hereditary component for autism and ASD and ADHD and various mental illnesses. See, I spoke earlier many times I've said in my other videos that the modern society we live in, it makes us mentally ill because depression and anxiety are both existential issues. However, I still believe that, and I still want you to know I believe that. However, we should not overlook the fact that there is also a strong possibility that a lot of it is down to genetics. There are many people who have a strong genetic propensity for conditions like depression and anxiety, and that's something that we should not overlook, especially if, by means of eugenics, we can go about treating it sensibly. Another example of a mutation, color blindness, which I have, incidentally. I have strong Dutan color blindness. I'll talk about that in a different video. Left-handedness. It's actually, there's a reason why people who are left-handed have been stigmatized through history. It's not normal. It's rare. Most people are right-handed. This is a sign of balance in the hemispheres of both brains. But people who are left-handed are said to be higher in other abnormalities, like autism. Also, interestingly enough, a little fact you may or may not have known, transgender people, lots of them, weirdly, happen to be left-handed. Make of that what you will. Now, the reason why... So, a lot of these mutations, you may think that they're seemingly minor, and they have nothing more than... all they do is change your external appearance. But that's not really true, because you got to understand that the human mind comprises of something like 85% of the human genome. So the chances are, if you have some kind of physical abnormality, like a cleft lip, club foot, or short height, for instance, or syndactyly, what this means is you most likely have some mental problems too, because physical mutations tend to be comorbid with mutations of the mind. And in essence, what I'm arguing is we now live in a world that is 4 generations, or not even that, 5 whole generations, God, even more than that, 6 or 7 generations removed from when the Industrial Revolution first started. And we now have a substantially large population of people nowadays who are born from successive generations upon generations of cumulative mutational load, all of whom are in some way begotten from ancestors who lived to produce children when they otherwise would have died, thanks to the advances in the Industrial Revolution. Now, do you think this is in any way unrelated to the fact that we're experiencing a rising mental health crisis and philosophies like antinatalism? You got to understand, I sympathize with antinatalists. I understand why they feel the way that they do, but from an anthropological perspective, from the perspective of a biologist, someone who calmly observes and makes notes of the course of nature. It's not a natural philosophy. It is not natural to not want to bring children in the world. It is, most animals live to reproduce. It's we measure how natural something is and how much of how unnatural it is by virtue of, does it help one function in the normal way? And in this way, from an anthropological perspective, antinatalism is not normal. So what I'm arguing is, it is highly likely that a lot of antinatalists, possibly myself as well, quite likely myself, in some way have, to some degree, they have some degree of mutational load, which it can manifest itself in various different ways. It can make people unattractive. It can give people strange congenital abnormalities. It can give people conditions, neurological conditions like autism, ADHD, or Asperger's, which in some way it impairs their ability to live normal, fulfilling lives, and hence, in a very roundabout and long-winded way, led them to the inevitable conclusion that their existence is meaningless and unfulfilling. There are many things out of life that they cannot get out of life. They are painfully aware of this, and so they reason that it is immoral to bring children into the world, and they want to cut off. They want to cut out the source of all their problems at the source. That is by refusing to procreate. My goodness, there is so much more I wanted to talk about. I'm probably going to have to break this into a part 3, because if I talk for much longer, I'm going to be late for work. But stay tuned. There will be more, I promise. I got to develop and flesh out my argument even more, and I wouldn't want to leave anything out on the. I wouldn't want to leave this incomplete in any kind of way. So stay tuned.